The air hanging over that old well wasn't just thick with Mississippi humidity. It was heavy with something else, a stillness so complete it felt almost alive, a quiet that had wrapped itself around Voss Hill for 20 long years. This was a silence born from secrets, the kind that clings to ancient stones and twists itself around the gnarled roots of old cypress trees. Edmund Voss stood there, his hands rough and calloused, his forehead creased with worry, feeling the full weight of that massive flat stone slab that had kept the well sealed for 2 decades. It wasn't just the physical heaviness of the rock pressing down on him. There was something else, an invisible pressure, the weight of stories nobody dared to tell, of a whole town choosing to forget. When that first screech of iron scraping against stone cut through the empty fields, a chill ran through the small crowd that had gathered. A faint smell started rising from below, earthy and damp, like soil that hadn't seen light in years, carrying with it the unsettling promise that what lay beneath was so much more than just stagnant water. The little town of Rafford had been holding its breath for 20 years. And now, as that seal finally broke, it seemed like the town was holding it once more, waiting for the truth to claw its way back to the surface. Before we dive deeper into what happened at the Voss Plantation, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment letting us know exactly which state or city you're listening from. This is the Fear Sermon, and we're just getting started. The year was 1887, and that Mississippi sun was beating down with a fury, baking those red clay roads until they turned into fine choking dust. Edmund Voss, a man whose 38 years had carved deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes, guided his horse-drawn buggy along a path that felt both familiar and completely foreign as he made his way toward Voss Hill. He had spent 5 years in Memphis working as a land surveyor, carefully mapping out parcels of earth, trying to bring some order to a world that felt more chaotic with each passing day. 5 years he had tried to push from his mind the image of that sprawling, decaying cotton plantation that carried his family's name. The place where he had grown up in the shadow of a father whose presence loomed as large as the grand, now crumbling manor house itself. His father, Harlan Voss, had passed away in 1882, leaving behind nothing but debt and decay. Those fields that once thrived, stretching across hundreds of acres, now sat mostly neglected, choked out by weeds and wild growth. The grand house, Voss Hill, once a proud symbol of antebellum success, now stood like a skeletal reminder of a time long gone. Its paint was peeling, its shutters hung crooked, and those once perfectly manicured gardens had been swallowed up by the wilderness creeping in from all sides. Edmund hadn't returned to Claiborne County out of some sentimental longing. He came back because he had to. A northern land company, interested in timber and maybe future development, had shown interest in the property. This was his chance, maybe his only chance, to salvage something from the wreckage of what he'd inherited. He needed to survey the land, to put some kind of value on the ghosts that haunted every single acre before any sale could move forward. The journey itself was painfully slow. That dust, fine as flour, settled on everything, his clothes, his skin, even the air he breathed tasted like dry earth and broken promises. The steady creak of the buggy wheels and the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves were the only sounds breaking through the heavy silence of that rural landscape. As he got closer to Rafford, that sleepy little town that served all the surrounding plantations, a hollow feeling started growing in his chest. It was that strange ache of coming back to a place you desperately tried to escape, only to find it waiting there for you, unchanged in its soul, yet completely transformed by time and neglect. Rafford itself seemed to have aged along with him. The wooden storefronts leaned more precariously now, the streets were quieter than he remembered. The locals, many of whom had known him since he was just a boy, greeted him with this strange mix of respect and discomfort. Their smiles were thin, their eyes quick to look away whenever he met their gaze. You could feel the tension in the air, this unspoken understanding that he, Edmund Voss, was now permanently tied to the decaying legacy of Voss Hill. He tried making small talk, asking about the old days, about how the county had changed, but their answers were short, evasive. It was like they'd all made some silent pact, a conspiracy of silence that he, now an outsider, wasn't welcome to join. One afternoon, while checking out the rundown barns, Edmund ran into Silas Pruitt. Silas, now in his early 70s with a stooped frame and a face weathered by decades in the sun, had served as the overseer for Harlan Voss for years. He was the kind of man whose loyalty never wavered, whose methods could be brutal but always effective in Edmund's father's eyes. Silas still lived in a small cabin on the edge of the property, a leftover from the old order, clinging to that land like a stubborn weed. "Young Mr. Voss," Silas rasped out, his voice rough with age and years of chewing tobacco. He squinted at Edmund, his eyes cloudy but still holding a spark of that old sharpness. "Didn't think you'd ever come back." "The land company, Silas," Edmund replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Got to assess the property." Silas nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward those distant overgrown fields. "The land, always the land." He paused, then his eyes flicked back to Edmund with a strange, almost fearful look. "There's some things best left alone, Mr. Voss. Some corners of this place, you might want to leave that one alone." Edmund, already overwhelmed by the massive task of cataloging this vast neglected estate, brushed off Silas's warning. He figured the old man was talking about some particularly nasty patch of briars or maybe a collapsing building not worth the trouble. He thanked Silas and kept working, making notes in his ledger, sketching boundaries, trying to make sense of the tangled mess that was Voss Hill. A few days later, while carefully mapping the area around what used to be the slave quarters, now just crumbling foundations and scattered timber, he saw it, the well. It sat in a clearing, half hidden behind a thick curtain of kudzu and wild grapevines, but it was unmistakably there. This wasn't just any well. It was a monument to something deliberately hidden. A massive flat stone, easily 5 feet across and a foot thick, sat flush with the ground, completely sealing the opening. Around its edge, heavy iron spikes as thick as a man's wrist had been driven deep into the earth, pinning that stone in place. Over 20 years, the vines and moss had crept over it all, weaving through the iron, creating this natural but sinister covering. Something about it just didn't look right. It didn't look like a normal well cover. It looked like a tombstone. It looked like a prison. A cold dread started creeping up the back of Edmund's neck. He tried to push it away, to tell himself it was probably just a safety measure, a way to prevent accidents on an abandoned property. But the sheer size of that seal, the deliberate almost violent way those iron spikes had been driven in, suggested something far darker. He went back to Rafford that evening with the image of that sealed well burned into his mind. He tried asking around again, more directly this time, about the well. He asked at the general store, at the blacksmith shop, even at that tiny dusty saloon. That old well up at Voss Hill, he'd start, trying to sound casual. "You know why they sealed it up?" The reactions were always the same. People would suddenly change the subject, look away quickly, mumble something about not knowing or it being before their time, even from men who'd lived in Rafford their whole lives. That silence was deafening. A whole town refusing to acknowledge a truth that everyone seemed to know, yet nobody dared speak aloud. Edmund Voss, the land surveyor, was used to uncovering hidden boundaries and forgotten markers. But this was different. This was a boundary made of silence, a marker carved from fear, and it was starting to consume him. The town of Rafford, Edmund quickly discovered, guarded its secrets with the fierce devotion of a religious sect. That silence surrounding the sealed well at Voss Hill wasn't just a lack of information. It was an active, almost aggressive refusal to speak. Every question he asked was met with a wall of averted eyes, mumbled excuses, or outright subject changes. The general store owner would suddenly find an urgent need to restock shelves. The blacksmith would start hammering on a piece of iron with renewed intensity, drowning out Edmund's questions. Even the old men who sat on the saloon porch, usually so eager to spin tales of the past, would grow quiet, their eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. It was a chilling display of collective amnesia, a town-wide conspiracy of silence that only made Edmund more determined. He realized if he wanted answers, he couldn't rely on spoken words. He would have to dig, not into the earth, but into the dusty archives of the county. His first stop was the county clerk's office in Rafford, a small cramped room crammed with towering stacks of ledgers and brittle yellowed documents. The clerk, a thin nervous man named Mr. Abernathy, seemed particularly uncomfortable with Edmund's presence, his hands fluttering over papers like he was trying to hide something. Edmund spent days poring over records, his surveyor's eye for detail serving him well. He sifted through property deeds, tax assessments, and official reports, searching for any mention of Voss Hill, of his father, or of that well. his persistence eventually paid off. Tucked away in a ledger marked Public Health and Sanitation Reports 1865 to 1870, he found it. An official report dated July 14, 1867, filed by Harlan Voss. The report stated in formal bureaucratic language that the well water at Voss Hill had become unfit for consumption, likely due to a miasmatic condition of the soil. It recommended immediate sealing to prevent the spread of disease. Edmund stared at that date. July 14, 1867. 20 years ago, almost to the day. That miasmatic condition explanation struck him as vague, almost deliberately so. It was a common enough theory back then, blaming disease on bad air. But it felt like a convenient catch-all, a way to explain away something without really explaining anything. He remembered something else from his childhood, something his father rarely talked about, but which had been a quiet, persistent presence on the plantation right after the war. A small community of formerly enslaved people had chosen to stay on at Voss Hill. They remained not as property, but as free laborers, working the fields, trying to rebuild their lives in the shattered landscape of the post-war South. There had been about 14 of them, men, women, and children, a self-contained community that had lasted through 1866 and into 1867. Edmund, as a boy, had occasionally seen them, heard their voices carrying from the quarters, a distant hum of life that had abruptly stopped. He decided to broaden his search to the Freedmen's Bureau records. The Bureau had kept an active office in nearby Port Gibson during Reconstruction, tasked with helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. It was a long, dusty ride to Port Gibson, but Edmund felt a growing urgency. He spent another week in the Bureau's archives, a more organized but equally neglected collection of documents. He found records of labor contracts, land disputes, and requests for aid. He meticulously cross-referenced names, dates, and locations. And then he found the gap. In a register of residents and laborers associated with Claiborne County plantations, under the heading Voss Hill Plantation, he located 14 names. They were entered in the spring of 1867, but there were no subsequent records, no entries indicating they'd moved away, no new labor contracts, no requests for assistance from other counties. Crucially, there were no death certificates. They simply vanished from the official record. 14 names entered, and then nothing. It was like they'd been erased from existence. Edmund's training as a surveyor, his instinct for patterns and anomalies, screamed at him. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a deliberate void. He returned to Voss Hill, that miasma report and the missing names swirling in his mind. He walked the grounds again, his gaze now fixed on that sealed well. It sat at the very center of what had once been the bustling heart of the slave quarters, surrounded by the faint outlines of cabins, the communal cooking fires, the small plots where families had tried to grow their own food. The location was chillingly precise. He remembered the county physician's log, Dr. Horace Gage. He'd seen a brief, almost dismissive entry in the county records. He went back to the clerk's office, insisting on seeing Dr. Gage's personal logs, a collection of leather-bound books that Mr. Abernathy reluctantly produced from a locked cabinet. After hours of searching, Edmund found it. A single entry dated July 16, 1867, 2 days after Harlan Voss filed his miasma report. The entry was brief, almost cryptic. Visited Voss Hill, found no evidence of disease, though conditions were irregular. Conditions were irregular. The phrase echoed in Edmund's mind, a chilling understatement that spoke volumes. It wasn't a medical diagnosis. It was an observation, a judgment, a carefully worded evasion. What conditions had Dr. Gage found? What had been so irregular that it warranted such a peculiar, almost coded description? That phrase would haunt Edmund for weeks, a persistent whisper in the back of his thoughts, a silent accusation from the past. The well, sealed and silent, seemed to mock his efforts, daring him to uncover the truth that Rafford had so carefully buried. The silence of Rafford was a formidable barrier. But Edmund Voss was a man used to breaking ground. He understood that official records, while crucial, often told only a fraction of the story. The real narrative, he suspected, lay in the memories of those who had lived through the time, those who had witnessed the events of 1867 from the edges. His search eventually led him to Ruth. Ruth lived in a small weathered cabin on the very edge of Rafford, nestled among a grove of ancient pecan trees. Her home was humble but meticulously kept, a testament to a life of quiet strength. She was an elderly black woman, her face a tapestry of wrinkles. Her eyes, though clouded by age, still held a deep knowing intelligence. She had been a young woman in 1867, barely out of her teens, working as a laundress for one of the more prominent families in Rafford. She had seen much, heard more, and understood even more than she let on. Edmund approached her with caution and respect, explaining his purpose, the mystery of the well, the missing names. Ruth listened patiently, her hands gnarled with age resting in her lap. For a long time, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin's window. Edmund felt the weight of her silence, the decades of unspoken truths that lay behind it. Slowly, hesitantly at first, then with growing clarity, Ruth began to speak. Her voice was soft, raspy, but each word carried the weight of memory. She spoke of the community at Voss Hill, the 14 souls who had stayed on after the war, clinging to the hope of a new life. She spoke of Delia. Delia, Ruth explained, was a woman in her late 30s, a figure of quiet strength and unwavering resolve. She had been the main house cook at Voss Hill for years, a position that had given her a unique understanding of the plantation's inner workings, its rhythms, and its secrets. More than that, Delia was the unofficial leader of the group, a natural matriarch who possessed both a sharp intellect and a compassionate heart. She was the one who organized their labor, settled disagreements, and most importantly, held their collective hope in her steady hands. She couldn't read or write herself, but she understood the power of words, the necessity of documentation in a world that sought to deny their very humanity. Her husband was August, a man of quiet dignity and immense skill. August was a carpenter, his hands capable of bringing beauty out of raw timber. He had built many of the cabins in the quarters, repaired the plantation's fences, and crafted furniture for the main house. He was Delia's rock, her steadfast partner, and a respected figure within their small community. Together, they had 3 children. Nora, a bright, curious girl of about 12, already showing signs of her mother's intelligence. Thomas, a spirited boy of 9, full of youthful energy. And Clara, a baby barely a year old, a symbol of their fragile hope for the future. There was also Hamp, August's older brother, a man whose quiet strength had a limp from an old injury sustained during his years as a field hand. Hamp was a man of few words, but his presence was a comforting anchor for the others. And then there was Rosalie, a young woman of about 20, whose spirit burned with an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. Rosalie had, against all odds and in defiance of the laws that had once forbidden it, taught herself to read. She had done so in secret, using a worn leather-bound Bible that had belonged to the plantation mistress, carefully deciphering the words by the flickering light of a stolen candle. Rosalie was the community's scribe, their connection to the written world, their voice on paper. The other 7 names, Ruth admitted, were harder to recall with perfect clarity. They were faces in a fading memory, echoes of lives lived and lost. She remembered a young couple, Cornelius and Nettie, who had recently married and dreamed of owning their own small farm. There was an older woman, Martha, whose wisdom was sought by all, and a quiet young man named Samuel, known for his gentle way with animals. The rest were children, their names now blurred by time, but their presence in that small community, their hopes and fears, were as real as the dust on the road. It was Rosalie, at Delia's direction, who had penned the letter that would ultimately seal their fate. Edmund found a copy of it in the county archives. A fragile yellowed sheet of paper, its elegant script a stark contrast to the brutal reality it described. It was dated April 3, 1867. The letter, addressed to the Freedmen's Bureau in Port Gibson, was a masterpiece of dignified appeal. It formally requested recognition of the group's labor contract with Harlan Voss, detailing the terms they had agreed upon for working the 1866 harvest. Crucially, it also asked for consideration for land allotment under the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, a federal law that offered public lands to freed people. The letter was signed by Delia, August, Hamp, and Cornelius, their marks carefully placed beside Rosalie's flowing script. The letter was not an act of defiance, but an act of faith. It was a belief in the promise of freedom, in the rule of law, in the possibility of a just future. It calmly stated that Harlan Voss had refused to honor the agreed-upon wages for the 1866 harvest, leaving them in a precarious position. It was a plea for help, a formal assertion of their rights as free citizens. Harlan Voss received a copy of this letter around April 10, 1867. The speed of his reaction was telling. Within 2 weeks, he had made the journey to Port Gibson and met privately with the local Freedmen's Bureau agent, a man named Colton Ferris. Ferris was known throughout the county as a man who, despite his official position, was deeply sympathetic to the plight of the local planters. He understood their difficulties in adjusting to the new labor system, their losses after the war. He was, in essence, a man who served 2 masters, and his loyalty often leaned toward the powerful white landowners who held sway in the region. Ruth's voice grew softer as she spoke of this period, her eyes distant. She described the palpable shift in the atmosphere around Voss Hill after that letter was sent. A quiet tension, a sense of foreboding that settled over the land like a heavy fog. The politics of Reconstruction in Mississippi were a brutal reality. The promise of black land ownership, of true economic independence, was met with fierce hostility by former Confederates who saw it as an affront to their very way of life. The vulnerability of Delia, August, Rosalie, and the others was immense. They were 14 souls standing on the edge of a new world, armed only with hope and a piece of paper, against the entrenched power of a system determined to keep them in their place. Ruth's words painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of their courage, their dreams, and the dark forces gathering against them. Harlan Voss was not a man given to grand speeches or dramatic shows of anger. His power was far more subtle, rooted in a cold calculating pragmatism that had served him well throughout his life. Edmund, through his father's old ledgers and the hushed whispers of the town, began to piece together the portrait of a man who, in 1867, was teetering on the edge of ruin. The war had stripped him of his most valuable assets, his enslaved workforce, and the economic chaos that followed had left his once vast cotton empire drowning in debt. He was a man who genuinely believed in the old order, in the natural rightness of white supremacy and the assumed subservience of black people. The idea of his former property not only demanding wages, but also claiming a right to land under federal law, was not just an economic threat. It was a deep personal insult, a challenge to his very identity and status. He was terrified of debt, of losing Voss Hill, of becoming an outcast among his peers. This fear, mixed with a deep-seated paranoia about the changing world, made him a dangerous man. He saw the Freedmen's Bureau and the entire Reconstruction government as an illegitimate intrusion, a foreign force trying to tear apart the fabric of Southern society. He had allies, of course. Men in Rafford and Port Gibson who shared his views, who felt the same gnawing fear of a world turned upside down. They were the local magistrates, the merchants, the other planters, all bound together by a common interest in maintaining the racial order and their economic power. Harlan's problem, though, was practical. Delia and her community were legally free. Their letter to the Bureau, carefully written by Rosalie, created a paper trail, a formal record of their complaints and their claims. The Southern Homestead Act, though often ignored, technically offered them a path to land ownership. This was a direct challenge to Harlan's authority, a precedent he could not allow to stand. The summer of 1867 in Claiborne County was a season of oppressive heat and simmering tension. The air hung heavy and humid, broken only by the buzzing of cicadas and the distant rumble of thunder. Edmund imagined his father during those months, his movements becoming more frequent, more secretive. Harlan would ride out from Voss Hill, not to check his fields, but to meet with men in hushed tones, in the back rooms of stores, or under the shade of ancient oaks. He met with Silas Pruitt repeatedly, the overseer's loyalty unwavering, his willingness to carry out Harlan's orders absolute. Silas, a man whose whole life had been defined by enforcing Harlan's will, would have seen any challenge to his master as a challenge to his own existence. More disturbingly, Harlan also met with Dr. Horace Gage, the county physician. Dr. Gage was a man of science, or so he presented himself, but he was also, Edmund discovered through careful cross-referencing of old county records and a few discreet inquiries, a quiet but active member of a local organization that operated under the innocent-sounding name of the Rafford Protective League. This was no mere social club. The League was a thinly veiled clan-adjacent group, a network of white men dedicated to preserving order and protecting Southern values, euphemisms for suppressing black progress and maintaining white dominance through intimidation and violence. Edmund found a single chilling reference to the League in a collection of letters from a Methodist circuit preacher. The preacher, who had visited Rafford in 1868, wrote to his denomination's leadership about organized terror operating in the name of order in the county, detailing instances of threats, property destruction, and disappearances aimed at discouraging freed people from voting or acquiring land. The preacher, a man of God, had been deeply disturbed by what he witnessed, but his words, like so many others, had been largely ignored by the wider world. Between June and July of 1867, as the cotton grew tall and the heat became almost unbearable, something happened at Voss Hill. Something that the town of Rafford collectively and deliberately chose not to see. The details remained hidden, blurred by time and that impenetrable wall of silence. But the pieces were starting to fit together for Edmund. His father's fear, the letter from Delia, the complicity of Silas Pruitt, the involvement of Dr. Gage, and the dark shadow of the Rafford Protective League. That sealed well, Edmund realized with a growing sense of dread, was not just a cover for contaminated water. It was a monument to a crime, a silent witness to a truth that had been buried alive. The suspense tightened around him, a cold knot forming in his stomach, as he knew with chilling certainty that he was about to uncover something far more disturbing than he had ever imagined. The decision to open that well was not made lightly. For weeks, Edmund had wrestled with what it might mean, with the consequences of disturbing a 20-year-old secret. The town's silence, Silas Pruitt's cryptic warning, Dr. Gage's unsettling entry, and Ruth's fragmented memories had woven a tapestry of dread around that sealed stone. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was no simple investigation into contaminated water. This was an excavation of a crime, a deliberate act of erasure. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him, but the surveyor's instinct, that relentless drive for truth, would not let him walk away. He couldn't ask anyone from Rafford to help. The silence was too deep, the fear too ingrained. Instead, he rode several miles out of the county to a small isolated farm where he knew two brothers, Thomas and William Hayes, lived. They were quiet, hard-working men, known for their strength and their discretion, and crucially, they had no ties to Rafford or the Voss family. He offered them a generous sum, explaining only that he needed help moving a very heavy stone. They agreed, their faces expressionless, their questions left unasked. The morning of the excavation dawned clear and hot, the kind of day where the air shimmers above the fields. Edmund, Thomas, and William arrived at the well with a wagon loaded with tools, heavy iron bars, thick ropes, a sturdy wooden tripod, and a block and tackle. The well sat in its clearing, still wrapped in kudzu, the iron spikes now clearly visible beneath the tangled vines. It looked less like a well and more like a forgotten altar, a place where something sacred had been entombed. The process was grueling, a slow, deliberate battle against time and nature. First, they had to clear away the dense overgrowth, hacking through thick vines that had woven themselves into a formidable net around the stone. The iron spikes, rusted and pitted, were almost swallowed by the earth. It took hours of back-breaking labor to dig them out, each spike groaning as it was pried from its 20-year slumber. The scrape of iron on stone, the dull thud of the crowbar against the earth were the only sounds breaking through the oppressive quiet. As the last spike was removed, a faint earthy smell, different from the usual dampness of the soil, started rising. It was a smell of deep earth, of stagnant water, but also something else, something impossible to name, ancient and unsettling. Edmund felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. They rigged the block and tackle to the sturdy wooden tripod, carefully positioning the ropes around the massive stone slab. Thomas and William, their muscles straining, began to pull. The stone resisted at first, then slowly, painfully, began to shift. A low grinding groan, like the earth itself sighing in protest, echoed through the clearing. As the stone lifted, a rush of air, cool and damp, surged from the depths of the well. It carried that strange unsettling scent, now stronger, more defined. The sound changed too. The chirping of cicadas seemed to fade, the rustle of leaves to quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. With one final mighty heave, the stone cover swung clear, crashing to the ground with a dull thud that sent birds scattering from the nearby trees. The well, dark and gaping, lay exposed. Edmund peered into the blackness, a chill running through him despite the oppressive heat. The water level was low, far below what he remembered from childhood. The air rising from it was heavy, thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and old. He lowered a lantern into the shaft. The flickering light struggled against the profound darkness, revealing only a murky expanse of water far below. He then lowered a weighted line, measuring the depth. It was deeper than he'd expected, almost 40 feet to the water's surface. "I'll need to go down," Edmund stated, his voice sounding strangely hollow in the sudden quiet. Thomas and William exchanged a glance but said nothing. They secured a sturdy rope around Edmund's waist, testing its strength. He took a deep breath, the scent from the well filling his lungs, and began his descent. The air grew colder, heavier as he went down. The walls of the well were slick with moss and ancient moisture. The lantern cast dancing shadows, making the darkness seem to press in from all sides. He reached the water's surface, his boots splashing softly. The water was still black, reflecting the lantern light like a shattered mirror. He scanned the bottom, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. And then he saw them. Beneath decades of silt and standing water, partially submerged, were bundles. They were wrapped in oilcloth, heavy waxed canvas bound tightly with thick wire. They lay scattered across the bottom, dark indistinct shapes against the murky floor. Edmund's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was what the town had buried. He carefully reached down, his fingers brushing against the cold, slick oilcloth. He pulled one bundle free, its weight surprisingly substantial. He signaled to the men above, and they slowly began to hoist him up, the bundle clutched tightly in his hand. Back on solid ground, Edmund laid the bundle on the grass. His hands trembled slightly as he began to unwrap the oilcloth. The wire, rusted but still strong, resisted his efforts. Finally, with a sharp tug, it gave way. The oilcloth peeled back, revealing not bones, not bodies, but something far more chilling in its implications. Documents. The first bundle contained a collection of brittle yellowed papers. They were damp but remarkably preserved by the oilcloth and the cool anaerobic environment of the well. He carefully spread them out. There was a folded copy of a labor contract identical to the one Delia had referenced in her letter to the Freedmen's Bureau. The very contract Harlan Voss had claimed never existed. There were affidavit pages bearing what appeared to be signatures, though faded, attesting to the terms of the agreement and the non-payment of wages. His hands shook as he reached for the second bundle. This one was smaller, more compact. As he unwrapped it, he found a small waterproof tin box. It was old, its metal tarnished, but it was sealed tight. With a grunt of effort, he pried it open. Inside, nestled among more carefully wrapped papers, was a journal. It was a small leather-bound book, its pages filled with elegant flowing script. Delia's journal, he realized, or rather Rosalie's careful handwriting rendering Delia's words. He opened it to a random page, his eyes scanning the words. A voice from the past suddenly speaking to him. And then beneath the journal, he found it. A single sheet of paper folded multiple times, its edges softened by time. It was a list of 14 names written in pencil in Delia's own hand. The paper, though fragile, had been preserved by the dry cold of the well's depths and the meticulous oilcloth wrapping. He read them aloud, his voice barely a whisper. Delia, August, Nora, Thomas, Clara, Hamp, Rosalie, Cornelius, Nettie, Martha, Samuel, and 3 other names less distinct but undeniably there. 14 names, including the baby Clara. The miasma report, the silence of Rafford, the irregular conditions. It all came together into a single horrifying truth. The well had not been sealed to contain disease. It had been sealed to contain evidence. What do you think Edmund is going to do with these shocking discoveries? I want to hear your theories in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button if this story has you gripped. You're watching the Fear Sermon, and trust me, we're not done yet. Edmund returned to Ruth's cabin, the tin box clutched in his hand, the weight of its contents pressing down on him. He laid the documents on her small worn table, spreading them out carefully. The labor contract, the affidavit, and most chillingly, Delia's list of 14 names. Ruth, her eyes wide, peered at the papers, her gaze lingering on the familiar script of Rosalie in the journal, and then on Delia's own careful pencil marks on the list. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound of deep sorrow and long-held pain. "I knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I always knew," but no one would listen. No one would speak. Edmund urged her to tell him everything, to finally break the silence that had suffocated Rafford for 2 decades. Ruth, her hands trembling, began to recount the events of that fateful summer, her memories now sharpened by the tangible proof before her. She was around 75 years old in 1887, but in 1867 she'd been a young woman living just outside the plantation boundary, close enough to hear the sounds of Voss Hill, but far enough to be considered outside its immediate reach. She worked as a laundress for a family in Rafford, walking those dusty roads every day, watching the subtle shifts in the town's atmosphere. It was July, Ruth began, her voice gaining strength as the memories flooded back. The heat was terrible, just like it is now. But there was another kind of heat, a bad feeling hanging over Voss Hill. Mr. Harlan, he was riding around more than usual, meeting with folks, his face tight like a drum. And Silas Pruitt, he was always right at his heels like a shadow. She spoke of the nights. "I heard the wagons, Mr. Voss. Not the regular farm wagons, but heavy ones moving slow late at night. 2 nights I heard them in the middle of July. The first night I heard voices low and gruff, and then a different sound, like something heavy being dragged. And then the second night it was quieter, just the wagons and then nothing." Ruth described the chilling silence that followed. After that second night, there was no more singing from the quarters, no children laughing, no sound of Delia's cooking fire, just quiet, a deep unnatural quiet. The next morning, driven by a gnawing unease, Ruth had walked to the edge of the road that bordered Voss Hill near where the quarters stood. What she saw, or rather what she didn't see, confirmed her worst fears. The quarters were empty. Utterly, completely empty. Every pot, every cloth, every small cherished possession they had owned, gone. It was as if those 14 souls had simply vanished into thin air. And the well, Ruth continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. The well, which had been open and in use the day before, where Delia would draw water for her cooking, where the children would play nearby, it was covered. That big stone just like you found it. And the spikes, it was like they wanted to make sure no one ever looked inside. She had told no one for 20 years. The fear had been too great, the consequences too dire. She had seen what happened to others who dared to speak out, who dared to challenge the established order. She had witnessed the swift brutal punishment handed out by men like Harlan Voss and the shadowy figures of the Rafford Protective League. Her silence had been a matter of survival. As she finished her story, Ruth reached into the pocket of her apron. Her hand, gnarled with age, slowly withdrew a small object. It was a carved wooden button, painted a faded almost imperceptible red. The paint was worn thin in places, but the delicate carving was still visible. "August made this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He made them for Delia's Sunday dress. She loved them. I found it in the road that morning near the quarters in July of 1867. It must have fallen off. I kept it. I don't know why. I just kept it." She pressed the button into Edmund's hand. It was warm from her touch, a small tangible link to a past that had been deliberately erased. The button, a simple token of love and craftsmanship, now carried the immense weight of a hidden tragedy. Edmund stared at it, then at the list of names, then at Ruth's tear-filled eyes. The truth, long buried, was finally beginning to surface, piece by agonizing piece. The full horror of what had happened at Voss Hill was slowly, inexorably revealing itself. This story is getting intense, isn't it? I mean, seriously intense. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, make sure you share this video with a friend and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. This is the Fear Sermon, and we're bringing these stories to light. The weight of that tin box, filled with its damning contents, felt heavier than any burden Edmund Voss had ever carried. The documents, Delia's journal, the list of names, and that small faded red button from Ruth. They were not just pieces of paper and wood. They were the echoes of lives brutally silenced, a testament to a profound injustice. Edmund knew with a chilling clarity that he could not simply walk away. The surveyor in him demanded truth. The man in him demanded justice, however delayed. His first step was to take the documents to the highest authority he could find. Judge Anson Whitfield in Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, the state capital, was a bustling city, a stark contrast to the quiet conspiratorial silence of Rafford. Judge Whitfield was a federal circuit judge, a man of stern demeanor and a reputation for upholding the law, even in the turbulent years after Reconstruction. But the year was 1887. Reconstruction was officially over. Federal troops had long since withdrawn from the South, leaving the region to deal with its own demons. The political environment was hostile, deeply resistant to any challenge to the established racial order, especially one that implicated prominent white families. Edmund presented his findings to Judge Whitfield in his chambers, laying out the documents with a meticulous precision that hid the turmoil in his soul. He recounted his investigation, the sealed well, the miasma report, the missing names, Ruth's testimony, and the chilling contents of the tin box. Judge Whitfield, a man used to the grim realities of the post-war South, listened with a grave expression, his eyes scanning the brittle papers, his fingers tracing the names on Delia's list. The legal process that followed was extraordinary, exhausting, and ultimately incomplete. Judge Whitfield, despite his personal convictions, was operating within a system designed to protect itself. The wheels of justice turned slowly, grinding against the entrenched power structures of Mississippi. Edmund found himself facing a wall of bureaucratic resistance, veiled threats, and outright hostility. His contacts in Memphis, legal colleagues he had consulted, advised him to drop it. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest, Voss," one had warned. "Some things are best left buried." But Edmund could not. He wasn't a hero, not in the traditional sense. He was a troubled man, haunted by the ghosts of his father's past, who found himself unable to look away from the truth he had unearthed. He pressed on, giving testimony, answering endless questions, facing down the thinly veiled accusations that he was simply trying to discredit his own family name. The first real development came with the disappearance of Silas Pruitt. In October 1887, just as Judge Whitfield's office began to issue subpoenas, Silas vanished from Rafford without a trace. His cabin was empty, his few possessions gone. The town offered no explanation, only a shrug of collective ignorance. It was a convenient disappearance, a key witness removed from the board, further complicating Edmund's efforts. Then came the partial statement from Dr. Horace Gage. Now elderly and gravely ill, his health failing rapidly, Dr. Gage was compelled to appear before Judge Whitfield. His testimony was hesitant, full of fear, but it was a confession nonetheless. He confirmed that he had been present at Voss Hill in the summer of 1867. He admitted that conditions were not natural, a chilling echo of his original log entry. He confessed that he had signed the miasma report under immense pressure from Harlan Voss and parties associated with the Rafford Protective League. He spoke of threats, of the fear of reprisal, of the overwhelming power of the League in the county. He died just days later, before a full deposition could be taken. His partial confession, a final desperate act of conscience. Despite the obstacles, Edmund achieved a small but significant victory. In December 1887, a summary of the documents he had found, along with a brief account of his investigation, was published in the Memphis Daily Appeal. The article, though carefully worded to avoid direct accusations of murder, laid bare the facts. The sealed well, the missing people, the fraudulent report, the names. It ran once. It caused a brief stir, a ripple of outrage in some northern newspapers. But in the South, it was quickly dismissed as Reconstructionist propaganda or sensationalist fiction. It caused a brief stir, a flurry of whispers in the drawing rooms of Jackson and Memphis. But then, like so many inconvenient truths, it disappeared from the public consciousness. No formal charges were ever filed. No one was ever prosecuted. The land was never returned to anyone. The legal system, in its slow, deliberate way, had chosen to look away. But the names were published. Delia, August, Nora, Thomas, Clara, Hamp, Rosalie, Cornelius, Nettie, Martha, Samuel, and the three others. Their names, once erased, were now, however briefly, etched into the public record. It was not justice, not in the way Edmund had hoped, but it was a recognition, a whisper of truth against a roar of silence. The aftermath of the well's opening and that brief unsatisfying legal skirmish left Edmund Voss a changed man. He did not sell the land to the Northern Company. He simply couldn't. He tried to explain it to his Memphis contacts, to the land agents who pressed him for a decision, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. How could he profit from ground that held such a terrible secret? From soil that had absorbed such profound injustice? A transaction, after everything he had found, felt obscene, a betrayal of the very truth he had fought to uncover. He had the well filled and sealed properly this time, not with a massive stone and iron spikes, but with earth and concrete, a final respectful burial. It was a symbolic act, an attempt to bring a measure of peace to the disturbed ground, to acknowledge the lives that had been swallowed by its depths. He kept the tin box. He kept Delia's journal, or rather Rosalie's careful handwriting, rendering Delia's words. He never opened it again after that first agonizing reading. The words, filled with hope and quiet dignity, were too painful, too stark a reminder of what had been lost. He donated the other documents, the contract, the affidavit, the miasma report, Dr. Gage's partial confession, to the records of the Federal Circuit Court in Jackson. There they were filed, catalogued, and for the most part forgotten, buried once more in the dusty archives of history, waiting for a future generation that might be willing to truly see them. Ruth lived until 1893, a quiet, dignified presence on the edge of Rafford. Edmund visited her twice after the article was published, making the long, dusty journey from Memphis. They would sit on her small porch, the air thick with the scent of pecan trees and unspoken understanding. They didn't say much. There was no need for words. Their shared knowledge, their quiet grief, bound them in a way that went beyond conversation. Over the following decade, Edmund began to sell smaller parcels of the Voss Hill land. He did so quietly, without publicity, and at prices significantly below market value. He sold them to black farming families in Claiborne County. Families who, like Delia and August, were trying to build something of their own, to carve out a life of independence on ground that had cost more than anyone should ever have to pay. It was not justice. He knew that. It was not restitution for the lives lost, for the dreams shattered, but it was what he could do. A small quiet act of defiance against the legacy of his father, a silent acknowledgement of the debt owed. Edmund Voss died in 1911 in Memphis of pneumonia. He was a man who had lived a life marked by a single haunting discovery. Among his few personal belongings, carefully tucked away in a small wooden box, was the carved wooden button Ruth had given him. The red paint was nearly worn through by then, faded to a faint blush, but it was still there, still whole, a small silent testament to a truth that had once shocked a town, and a burden that one man had chosen to carry long after the world had forgotten. What did you think of this story? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a good mystery. Hit that like button, subscribe to the Fear Sermon, and I'll see you in the next one.